This is Mr. Electricity, Steve Regal, and you are listening to the one and only Dave Dynasty Show.
My little itty-bitty bruiser buddies.
United States heavyweight champion, Brazil.
The world's heavyweight champion from the AWA, Nick Bockwinkel.
The Midwest supporting, bruiser loving, positivity spreading, world's most dangerous podcast. Join former pro wrestler and promoter Dave Dynasty as he supports and promotes Midwest pro wrestling. Keep on growing with the Midwest Express. This is the Dave Dynasty Show.
Greetings and welcome to the Dave Dynasty Show. Hey, we are back. Did you miss us? I know we were on a bit of a break. Took a while off. Let me, for those of you who do not follow me on social media, and if you don't, why don't you? It completes your experience here with the Dave Dynasty Show. I post a lot of cool things online. You can find me on Facebook by looking up Dave Dynasty, or you can look up the Dave Dynasty Show. You can find me on Twitter at the Dave Dynasty. I'm on Instagram at _Dave Dynasty. And of course, you want to follow our YouTube channel. Look up Dave Dynasty there. But if you don't follow us on social media, you may not know what's going on here. We put our last episode out, I think it was around October. So we've been off for a couple months now. And the reason being is, for the first time in my 40 plus years, I no longer live in Indiana. That's right. The Midwest boy is now a resident of North Carolina. I moved here for my job, and frankly, I'm loving it. I love North Carolina. I love lots of things about it. It's very cool to live in a different part of the country and explore what is a whole different region. But there are things that I miss about Indiana and I miss about the Midwest. But to be quite honest, though, we've been gone for 2 months and we've already visited, been back twice. So there'll be plenty of trips back. But anyway, that's why with the relocation for work and getting accustomed and getting settled in a new home and a new area, that's why the show's kind of been on this break for a while. But we're back now because I am settled. Everything's good. We are back to roll. And yes, the show is keeping its focus. We are still focused on Midwest professional wrestling, particularly the history of said Midwest pro wrestling, because that's my passion. That's my background. That's what I grew up on and what I love. And we have a great one for you today. We got John Lawson on doing one of his segments. And he's going to talk about the last WWA show held at the Indianapolis State Fairgrounds. This show was held on August 22nd, 1980. And we thought this was kind of relevant because recently AEW hosted or promoted a show there. There are still some groups occasionally that go in there. So we thought it was pretty relevant to look at this show. The last time Dick the Bruiser Wilbur Snyder and the WWA ran there. It was a great show. John's going to talk all about it. He, of course, was there. And this was his time period. He was very, very entrenched in the WWA. And then, as I was talking to John, we also wanted to do another segment. He particularly wanted to do it where we talk about Jim Busche, a guy who's a great, long-time Midwest professional wrestling fan, very involved in the scene from being a timekeeper and different things, record keeper, a historian of sorts. Things he did was great. He is one of the top Midwest professional wrestling fans of all time. And John wanted to do a segment on him and remember him. So we do that as well. He talks about that and talks about Jim. And that's how we're back. And we're focused, again, on the particularly the history of Midwest Pro Wrestling, because it doesn't get enough exposure, we feel. John Lawson will be on regularly doing things. A lot of times it'll be conversations between he and I. A lot of times it'll just be the segments that he records. And we'll have other guests on. We'll have other interviews on where we're going to dive into this stuff in depth. Again, follow us on social media. I gave all that out earlier. And you want to follow because, like I said, I post a lot of newspaper clips and photos and things that go along and correspond with what we talk about. So it is great to be back and doing this. I've missed the podcast and I've missed the interaction with the fans. And remember, wherever you listen to us, please make sure you give us a share and a rating and a review. If you listen to us on iTunes via that platform, please go on and give us a rating and a review. That helps with that algorithm when you get these suggested shows, like when people listen to wrestling podcasts and it has other shows you may like. Those rating and reviews help that algorithm that gets us mentioned and helps our exposure and everything else. So please just take a moment and go on there and do that. When I share these episodes, on the social media platforms, please share those. And that's our greatest weapon is the word of mouth of you guys. So help spread the word, help us grow and continue as we get this truck rolling again and get the Midwest Express rolling on down the tracks again. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will have that first segment of John Lawson talking about that last WWA Fairgrounds show from 1980. So stick around. Hey, make sure you visit DaveDynasty.com. That is your central hub for everything within the world of the Dave Dynasty Show. From there, you can find links to follow us on all of our social media accounts. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course YouTube, which you will want to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have lots of classic wrestling, every episode of the podcast, and other exclusive features there. While you're at DaveDynasty.com, check out the links to help financially support the show. That is how we keep this free every week. You can go to ProWrestlingTees.com/The Dave Dynasty and buy a shirt to help us out. PayPal.me/The Dave Dynasty to make a one-time financial contribution. Patreon.com/The Dave Dynasty to make ongoing monthly contributions. Or you can click our affiliate links for Amazon.com and HighSpots.com. No additional charge to you, but it helps us out. Thank you for your support, and check out DaveDynasty.com to complete your experience with The Dave Dynasty Show.
Since 2001, drug companies dumped 1 billion opioid pills in West Virginia, causing over 3,000 overdose deaths and thousands of babies born addicted by no fault of their own. I'm attorney Stephen New. If you're the grandparent or guardian of a child born with neonatal abstinence syndrome, call me. I'll help you seek just compensation.
Call the law offices of Stephen P. New at 1-844-BAD-PILLS before time runs out.
On this week's Dave Dynasty Show, we will be taking a look at an entire card that took place in Indianapolis in 1980. Plus, I have to make mention of the passing of two important people associated with Indiana wrestling and the WWA. One that fans of the business in the 60s, 70s, and 80s will remember, and the other, well, most of you probably do not know, but I will tell you about the man who probably attended more WWA and independent wrestling matches in Indiana than anyone else. We will devote an entire segment to Sergeant Jacques Goulet, also known as Rene Goulet, in the coming weeks. But the second passing was of a great wrestling fan and a correspondent to fans all over the country, James W. Busche, who lived most of his life in Plainfield, Indiana. I'll have more about my friend and why he was such an important figure in the wrestling scene at the end of this podcast, and I'd appreciate it if you were able to take the time to learn about him. And I'll share a couple of stories that always made me laugh, and you may find them to be funny as well. Recently, All Elite Wrestling made its Indiana debut when AEW Wednesday Night Dynamite took place live on TNT on Wednesday, November 20th, 2019. With that show taking place at the Coliseum in Indianapolis, Dave Dynasty and I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the final WWA wrestling show to take place at the fairgrounds. Indiana Farmers Coliseum, located at the Indiana State Fairgrounds in Indianapolis, first opened in 1939 and has been known by several names, including the Indiana State Fairgrounds Coliseum, the Pepsi Coliseum, and now with the naming rights sold to Indiana Farmers Insurance, with its present name of Indiana Farmers Coliseum. This is the building where the Beatles made their only appearances in Indianapolis all the way back in 1964, and it was also the home of the Indiana Pacers, first of the ABA, and then later the NBA, and that was from the Pacers' inception back in 1967 until Market Square Arena opened in downtown in 1974. The building is also infamous for a terrible incident that took place during a 1963 ice show when a propane explosion killed more than 70 people and injured nearly 400. I'm not old enough to know about this event firsthand, but I've heard stories about it throughout my life. Apparently there was a propane leak, and a spark from a popcorn machine was believed to have ignited the blast that made a portion of the building look like a war zone, as it was described. As a kid in the 1970s, when I was learning about photography from the late Terre Haute photographer Chuck Strasberg, I remember him telling me that for many years this building banned the use of flash bulbs for photography. When I first started taking pictures, I used flash bulbs, which you could use for a single picture, and then you had to replace it, or you might have a bulb that would rotate. allowing you to use it for 4 single pictures before it had to be discarded and replaced. Battery-powered electronic flash units were just becoming common whenever I was learning about photography. The Fairgrounds Coliseum was the primary home for Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder's Championship Wrestling, otherwise known in the wrestling business as the WWA, the World Wrestling Association, in the 1960s after they had outgrown the local armories in Indy, and they would host regular WWA cards that took place there once or twice a month until the Indiana Convention Exposition Center opened in 1972. From that point on, WWA shows usually took place at the Air-Conditioned Expo Center, as TV commentator Sim Menaker always referred to it, or at Market Square Arena, which became the main arena for concerts and sporting events once it opened. The WWA returned to the Coliseum occasionally whenever there would be conflicting dates with the Expo Center, and at another time whenever the Expo Center was under construction for remodeling, but they returned to the Coliseum one final time in the summer of 1980 during the State Fair. And on this podcast, we're going to examine the entire show. It was an 8-bout card that featured what some referred to as a Japan main event, a tag team match with 4 international superstars, the world's most dangerous wrestler, Dick the Bruiser, teaming up with the world's most scientific wrestler, Wilbur Snyder, against the one-time pairing of King Kong Bruiser Brody and Nick Bockwinkel. On Friday night, August 22nd, 1980, the WWA presented an 8-match card at the Fairgrounds Coliseum. Just 6 nights earlier, the WWA had staged an event at the Expo Center as their regular monthly event. With this card being held less than a week after that card, and the fact that it was not at their regular venue, a smaller crowd turned out than what we would typically see at the Expo Center or at Market Square. This card was taped for television as 2-hour-long shows with 4 matches on each show, just like the regular monthly events in Indianapolis. In the opening event, Luis Martinez defeated Juan Zapata. Luis, which is spelled Luis, but pronounced Luis, or as he was also known to many fans and in many territories as Louis Martinez. By 1980, Martinez was already somewhat of a legend, having wrestled for almost 30 years. Luis Martinez was a career babyface and once held the WWA Tag Team title with Wilbur Snyder as his partner, and he was known by his nickname, Arriba Luis Martinez, with Arriba being his victory yell when he'd have a fiery comeback against his opponents. Years later, Tito Santana borrowed the Arriba war cry. Martinez at one time wrestled in the WWA as an Indian wrestler, going by the name of Apache Louie. And we'd also like to point out that this Luis Martinez is not related to the Luis Martinez that uses the same spelling, and perhaps it is his actual spelling of his name. And he's the wrestler that had appeared in Ring of Honor as Punisher Martinez and now wrestles in NXT as Damian Priest. Juan Zapata, on the other hand, was a local wrestler in Indianapolis, and he was someone who never won a match in the WWA, and probably nowhere else for that matter. Another interesting thing about Louis Martinez is that he was missing a finger, and the story goes that he lost that finger in a match while wrestling a bear early in his career. Match number 2 was a match featuring midget wrestlers. At the time, that was the way they were billed, and they were referred to as midget wrestlers. In this match, Wee Willie defeated the Mighty Cupid. Wee Willie and Mighty Cupid were both from Indiana and trained together and almost always wrestled one another. Willie was at one time the boyfriend of local female wrestler Alice Cooper, and Mighty Cupid is someone that Rip Rogers has told an interesting story about. After retiring from wrestling, it seems that Cupid attempted suicide by jumping off of Market Square Arena, but he survived. I don't have the details on when or exactly what happened, but I think it is safe to say that he must not have jumped from the top of the building, since that would have been impossible for anyone to have survived. Willie and Cupid were originally trained by the likes of Spike Huber and Prince Pullins, and as a result, when these midgets first started wrestling, their style was more like the full-size wrestlers, and they didn't have as many of the smooth comedy moves that the likes of other midget wrestlers of the day included. And after being in the business for a year or so, they were booked into the George Goulas territory, where they picked up on the style that midgets from the day, such as Lord Littlebrook, Little Tokyo, and others were adept at. And from that point on, Willie and Cupid put together much better matches. While in Goulas' territory, they were booked to wrestle almost every night of the week and against other opponents, and the experience paid dividends for these two. In match number 3, Steve Regal from Indianapolis returned to the area and the friend of the show, Dr. Jerry Graham Jr. And, of course, we always like to make mention that for newer wrestling fans, this Steve Regal is not the Lord Steven Regal from WCW, WWE, and NXT. This is the one that was from Indianapolis, was married to the daughter of Wilbur Snyder, and went on to be the junior heavyweight champion in many territories, as well as at one time held the AWA tag team title with Jimmy Garvin as his partner. In the fourth match of the evening, which served as the main event for the first hour of TV tapings, Gentleman Jerry Valiant defeated Bobo Brazil by countout. Both men were fighting on the outside of the ring, and Valiant rolled into the ring, beating the 20 count, getting the win over the master of the Cocoa Butt. It should be noted that the countout rules in those days were a 20 count, and not a 10 count that most promotions have adopted today. Part of this was because the WWA refs had to actually count when wrestlers fought on the outside, and if they didn't make it back into the ring by the 20 count, the commission rules were that the match had to end, even if that was not the planned finish. The refs may not start their 20 count immediately, which would allow skirmishes outside the ring to take place longer than the regular 20 count. Now, in today's WWE, it seems like they stretched the count of 10 out longer than a 20 count in the WWA back in the day had lasted, and the art of the count-out finish almost seems lost on the WWE. Match number 5 kicked off the second hour of TV tapings, which meant that some of the wrestlers who competed in the first hour would now also be competing in the second hour. And in the fifth match of the night, Dr. Jerry Graham Jr., who lost during the first half of the show, gained a pinfall victory over local wrestler Jose Alicia. In match number 6, Steve Regal, in his second appearance, got a pinfall victory over Dutch Savage. Savage's real name was Steve Howe, and he was a local wrestler. No one knows why, including Steve Howe himself, why Bruiser decided to give him the same name of a more famous wrestler. The original Dutch Savage was a top star in the Pacific Northwest, and had also competed in the Central States and in the AWA in the 1960s, so Bruiser would have wrestled on some of the same cards as that Savage. Perhaps he had a beef with the original Savage, and he decided to place that name on a preliminary wrestler to try to hurt his reputation, or maybe disliked the name. This Dutch Savage, by the way, eventually married woman wrestler Alice Cooper that I had mentioned earlier. In match number 7, the semifinal match of the night, we had a 15-minute draw between Spike Huber and Golden Boy Paul Christie with manager Miss Bunny Love. Huber and Christie had been feuding the territory from the moment that Christie turned heel on Huber in a tag team match in Indy. They always worked well together, and this match was no exception. I would have to say that these two probably had their best matches against one another, and I'm sure that both viewed the other as being one of, if not their favorite opponent to be in the ring with. As time ran out, Huber had Christie in a submission hold, but the time did expire, so both men had their arms raised in a draw. Then we had the main event, where we had the 4 all-time greats, as Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder teamed up to face King Kong Brody and Nick Bockwinkel. Bruiser and Snyder were the original WWA Tag Team Champions and held the tag title on 3 occasions. After losing the belts in the 1960s, they actually rarely teamed together. In 1978, they battled Jimmy and Johnny Valiant in a cage match with Texas Deathmatch rules, And I believe that this match in the summer of 1980 was then the final time that they ever teamed together. In most of the WWA cities outside of Indianapolis, Bruiser and Snyder rarely, if ever, appeared on the same card. King Kong Brody had been appearing in the WWA to feud with Bruiser over the previous 2 years and had traded the WWA Championship with him. Bockwinkel had made a couple of appearances in Indianapolis in the 1970s and had come into the territory in July 1980 to face Bruiser, the WWA champion, in a title unification match. Bockwinkel had been advertised as the AWA champion leading into a July match with Bruiser, but the night before that match took place in Indianapolis, Bockwinkel dropped the AWA world title that he'd held since 1975 to Vern Gagne. Bach did not appear with the AWA belt and was not referred to as the AWA champion the night of the so-called unification match. Some of my correspondents from this time period told me that the match with Bruiser and Snyder taking on Brody and Bockwinkel was like a Japanese main event, since Japan would often bring in main event talent and pair them in tag teams that were rarely, if ever, seen in the United States. My photos and story about this match were published in the Wrestling News, and I also had one of the leading Japanese wrestling publications use them as well. One of my correspondents during this time was the famed wrestling photographer Koichi Yashizawa, who took pictures for all the leading U.S. and Japanese magazines and always signed his name Koichi, K-O-I-C-H-I, in the corner of his photos. He reached out to me to have the pictures used in one of their publications since Brody was one of the top stars appearing in Japan at the time, and Bockwinkel was coming off of a 5-year run as the AWA champion, plus Bruiser and Snyder had been in many main events in Japan in the 1960s and 70s. The main event did not have a clean finish, but was a good match with lots of heat, with Brody at the peak of his career and Bockwinkel having been at the top of his game for several years at this point in time. Bruiser and Snyder had already reached legendary status for all they had accomplished in the 50s and throughout the 60s and 70s. Every time Dick and Brody stepped into the ring against one another, there was intensity that you could feel, and the excitement from the crowd was different from any of the other main events of recent years at that time. The intensity was similar to the hottest feuds in the 70s that had preceded Bruiser and Brody, such as when Bruiser and the Sheik renewed their rivalry, and when Bruiser and Ernie Ladd faced one another back when Ladd was using his King of Wrestling gimmick with Bobby Heenan as his manager. For this tag team match, Brody and Bockwinkel were declared the winners by countout, and this occurred when all four were fighting outside the ring. Bruiser and Bockwinkel were the legal men in the ring, but Brody prevented Bruiser from beating the referee's count. I also remember that Snyder may have received a legitimate wrist injury during this match, as when it concluded, Snyder was favoring his wrist and arm, and Bruiser was checking him out after the match. The result of this main event led to single matches that topped the next two Indianapolis cards, first with Bruiser facing Brody again, and then facing Bockwinkel in a rematch from their July encounter. So this match actually set up those next two main events. Bruiser lost, and Bockwinkel was the legal man in the ring, so he lost to him, but Brody caused him to lose by holding on to him and keeping him from entering the ring to beat the 20 count. Prior to the July match with Bruiser facing Bockwinkel in what was billed as a title unification match, the WWA had announced that the figurehead promoter and matchmaker, Bob Luce, was going to determine who the real world heavyweight champion was. In June 1980 at the Expo Center, it was announced that there were 3 promotions that claimed to be the world champion. They specifically mentioned Dick the Bruiser as the WWA champion, even though the promotion rarely referred to itself as the WWA. They mentioned Nick Bockwinkel as the AWA champion and Harley Race as the NWA champion. They didn't refer to the WWF champion as being a world champion at the time, but if you look back in history at that point, that promotion was actually a member of the NWA. Thus, they did not officially call the WWF champion a world champion when they were a member of the NWA. By the night of July 18th, 1980, when Bruiser and Bockwinkel wrestled in what was to be the unification match between the WWA and AWA champions, the entire angle to crown a single world champion was dropped. Now, Harley Race did come into the area 2 years later, but by that time, he was no longer the NWA champion. I thought that it was interesting that AEW held their next two shows in cities that were also part of the WWA territory. The week after Indy, they were in Chicago, which I know was an AWA city since their champs were the ones that were recognized. But the stars of the WWA would be featured up and down the cards, sometimes even outnumbering the number of AWA wrestlers on the bill. And the week after Chicago, they were in Champaign, Illinois, which was also a regular stop in the WWA. To close this podcast of the Dave Dynasty Show, I must report the death of a great friend of mine and a huge wrestling fan, James Busche. Many of you probably don't know who this man was, but if you attended matches in Indianapolis and the surrounding area in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you probably knew him or at least would recognize him. Jim Busche was the timekeeper for many area promotions, and before becoming the official timekeeper for many of the Indianapolis independent promotions, he kept records of every match he attended or watched on television. As a result, he was known as the timekeeper, Jim Busche, or Jim Busche, as many of us called him, and his wife even referred to him as Bushy. Jim was born in Connersville, Indiana, in 1935, and lived and worked most of his life in Plainfield, Indiana. Jim passed away at age 84 on December 13th, 2019, in South Carolina, where he relocated to live with his son and daughter-in-law and their children after the death of Jim's wife, Patty, a few years ago. Because of his age, Jim was around the area and a big wrestling fan in the 50s and a fan when the WWA was formed by Bruiser and Snyder in 1964 and throughout the entire run of the promotion. When other groups expanded nationally and began running cards in Indianapolis, Jim was also there to not only see the WWF, but also the AWA and the NWA. This was in addition to the outlaw and independent groups that began to pop up in the 80s and onward. If Jim knew about a show taking place and was able to attend, he would be there. I first came in contact with Jim when I was just a kid in the 1970s. I noticed this tall man who carried around a clipboard and a stopwatch. I started publishing my own wrestling newsletter when I was just 13 and came to realize that Jim was taking notes about the matches, kind of like what I was doing too, although I didn't carry a stopwatch. A number of people did keep notes on the matches they attended, but few, if any, bothered to keep the time of the matches. I remember Jim discovered that the WWA would announce matches that were being taped for TV as having a 15-minute time limit. And if it was going to be a time limit draw, however, they would trim off time in the match in order to ensure that they'd have time for 4 matches on TV, along with promo interviews between each segment, plus commercials. Jim was the only one to come to me with this proof that the match actually lasted something like 12.5 minutes instead of the announced 15 minutes. At house shows, the timing was legit, as my brother was the timekeeper for all the matches in Terre Haute in the 70s until the promotion went into pause mode back in 1982. And he was never instructed to trim off time or provide timing updates that were not legit to the ring announcer. So the trimming of time was really just regulated to the TV matches. Jim had correspondents that he traded results, newspaper clippings, and programs with. I don't know if you can really determine who the greatest wrestling fan of all time is or was, or the greatest anything for that matter, but if I were asked who the greatest fan of WWA and Indiana wrestling in general was, I would nominate Jim. Jim loved wrestling. Now, he occasionally had to miss a show if he had to work, since he worked the night shift at a printing company in Plainfield until he retired in the early 2000s. And I remember he also missed a card in order to attend his high school reunion, and perhaps if the weather was really bad, he might miss a show. But he would have attended over 90% of the matches held in Indianapolis for decades. Evansville, Indiana ran shows weekly every Wednesday throughout the 70s and into much of the 80s under the Goulas, Welch, Jarrett Promotions banner. And I suppose there might have been a fan or two who attended 50 or more shows there for years, but there were not a lot of other cards taking place in Indiana near Evansville during that time. Evansville had been a WWA city up until the early 70s when Bruiser leased the promoting rights to Gulas and Welch. But for all practical purposes, it's really been part of the Memphis promotion from that point on. Jim Busche may have attended more shows than anyone else in the Indianapolis area. That's something we'll never know, but what I do know is that he loved this sport. His record keeping was not limited to just the live events, as he also included the TV shows, which were often repeats of previous WWA broadcasts, since they didn't have a new tape to air every week. Jim watched them all, whether they were new or a repeat. He was also a great collector. He loved collecting programs and posters for wrestling events, and he created his own content with his record keeping. And when independent promotions asked him to be their timekeeper, he could not have been prouder. I don't know if any of the promotions paid him to ring the bell, but they did let him into the show for free, and that seemed to be good enough for him as he got to be a part of the show. Jim was a nice man who never had a bad word to say about anyone. The closest would have been when someone stole his bag with Dick the Bruiser's picture printed on it. It was a bag that he'd had for years, and he used it to carry his materials to the matches. He had his printouts of the recent wrestling results for anyone that wanted him, and he also had his ever-present stopwatch that he carried in that bag. He was not happy when it was stolen, and I could not blame him. Jim and his wife used to drive from Plainfield to Terre Haute to watch WWE and WCW pay-per-views at my home, and we loved having him over. My interest in wrestling waned quite a bit by the mid-2000s, I'd have to say, yes. Up to that point, I had bought or watched every pay-per-view with the exception of a few of the in-your-house WWF pay-per-views. I eventually lost contact with Jim, which I greatly regret. Jim was not totally deaf, but he was, as they say, hard of hearing. He could read lips, but that required him to be in close proximity to the person speaking to him. And if the TV was loud enough or the announcements at the matches were loud enough, he could hear what was being said. And this plays into a story that I will share with you in just a few moments. I don't know if Jim had a favorite wrestler, but he definitely favored the baby faces over the heels. I believe that Dick the Bruiser was his all-time favorite. On December 20th, a memorial for Jim took place at the St. Susanna Catholic Church in Plainfield. A number of folks from the wrestling community attended this event. When speaking to Jim and Patty's only child, John, I asked if they had planned on having anyone speak at Jim's services. He was not aware of anyone who planned to speak. I had met John just once before this day, and that was at his wedding reception in the 90s, as he was already living in South Carolina at that point. I told him that the stories that I had to tell might sound like I was making fun of Jim, and while it does poke fun at him, I assured him that it was all good-natured. After explaining to him what the stories were about, John gave me his blessing to share them. The first story took place, I believe, right after the death of Eddie Gilbert, which would have been in 1995, and that would have placed this at Circle City Wrestling in Indianapolis. Jim was the timekeeper, and before the matches started, Mike Samples, who also ran CCW, entered the ring to announce the death of Gilbert. Eddie had never appeared in CCW, but he was such a respected name to promoters all over the country that Mike wanted to acknowledge his passing with a 10-bell salute. The only problem is that Mike didn't explain to Jim exactly what he was planning on doing before coming to the ring, and Jim's hearing impairment prevented him from hearing exactly what they were saying about a 10-bell salute. They motioned for Jim to ring the bell, and he did. He paused after it rang the first time, and they signaled him to ring it again. And he did it for a second time. They motioned again and instructed him to keep ringing the bell. So Jim rang it a third time, then a fourth, then a fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, and 11th time. I think we were at 12 or 13 before we stopped him from ringing the bell again. We all, including Jim, chuckled when he explained to him that it was a 10-bell salute to a fallen grappler. The next story took place probably around 1997, again at Circle City Wrestling. By this point, they were moving the shows to different venues, but I believe this card was held at the Stout Field Armory. The main event was a tag team match with the Eliminators, Perry Saturn and John Cronus, who came in from ECW for about a month of Thursdays. I believe they faced the masked tag team of the Phantoms, who would have been Troy Haste and Jerry Faith. The match got out of hand with fighting outside the ring and eventually saw chairs flying into the ring and around ringside, first by the wrestlers and then by some of the fans. Things were starting to get out of control, and it got worse when other wrestlers from the locker room entered the fray. Instead of taking pictures at ringside, I remember I was shooting video. Normally I'd shoot at ringside since I had all access, but I know that I ended up shooting from a distance, probably when the chairs started flying. We had a manager in CCW that was from Kentucky or Tennessee. His name escapes me at the moment, but I know that he had a run in Memphis, and he was a pretty good manager. He kind of reminded me of the actor that played Bud Bundy on the old TV show Married with Children. And the manager was kind of instigating the whole ordeal, and that's when something happened that I didn't expect. All of a sudden, I saw Jim walk up to the manager, who kind of looked at him like a cocky manager would and should, with kind of like a, "What are you going to do?" attitude. Jim then reached out and grabbed the manager's shirt by the shoulder and wouldn't let go. I think Jim even kind of snarled at him, something I'd never seen in him before. The manager at first thought that Jim was just trying to act as part of security, which was practically non-existent at the venue, by the way. I don't know what he said to Jim, but I'm guessing it was something like, "WTF do you think you're doing?" The manager's main member of his stable was Kentucky's Victor Lewis, who had come into CCW using the name Bone Crusher Lewis. Then he bleached his hair and transformed into Vic the Bruiser, the alleged illegitimate son of Dick the Bruiser. Vic saw that his manager was being restrained by Jim, and like any wrestler would be expected to do, he came to the aid of his fellow man. He said something to Jim, and the next thing I saw was Vic take both hands and shove Jim to the chest with a lot of force. Jim let go of the manager, and then it almost seemed like a scene from a movie. He started moving backwards, trying to catch his balance. He must have traveled 20 feet backwards, and just when you thought he might gain his footing, he fell to the floor. In trying to break his fall, he hurt his wrist just a little bit. But this was the night that the timekeeper, Jim Busche, took his first, and I hope his only, bump in pro wrestling, making him a true member of the fraternity. I recall that we checked on Jim to make sure that he was okay, and I know that we told him he could never get involved in a match like that again, and I'm sure he didn't. My wife and I never told Jim's wife, Patty, about this incident because we were afraid that she might not let him go to the matches anymore. At Jim's services, we next conducted a 10-bell salute with the bell that belongs to a fixture around Indianapolis wrestling, Steve Branham. And another fixture of the local wrestling scene, Dan Garza, had the honor of ringing the bell. A funeral mass for Jim was then conducted, with the priest tying a few biblical stories into wrestling. After the matches, I got to meet a few more of Jim's friends from his working days. They all have fond memories of him, just as those of us that knew him through wrestling did. I had the opportunity to chat with his 5 grandchildren, the offspring of Jim and Patty's only child, John, who, by the way, said that Jim never told him about that night that he got involved in the near riot and ended up being knocked down. Jim's daughter-in-law, Alicia, thanked me for sharing the stories about Jim and said that he would have gotten a kick out of having the 10-bell salute in his honor. I thanked the family, too, because it was somewhat therapeutic for me. None of his grandchildren are currently wrestling fans, but they did say that they used to watch it with him. The 2 oldest boys are now in college at the Citadel, and James, who's named after Jim, wrestled while in high school. The grandchildren also told me that when Jim moved to South Carolina to live with him a few years ago, that they brought a lot of Jim's wrestling collection with him. The collection included some wrestling figures, all of which were still in the original packaging. Being kids, they got some of them out one day and tore into the packages so that they could play with the figures. They said that this was the only time they can remember that he was ever mad at them, yelling, "No, you can't open them." But I'm sure he forgave them. In closing, I want to reiterate that James W. Busche may have been the greatest wrestling fan the state of Indiana will ever know. Parents and grandparents have unconditional love for their children and grandchildren. Many sports enthusiasts may claim to have unconditional love for their favorite team, But Jim truly had an unconditional love for professional wrestling, and that's something that most of us cannot claim. I know I can't, as I've been critical of events in the 70s to the present. But Jim loved the sport no matter what. It did not matter to him if he was watching the best in the business or seeing two rookies in their first match. He loved it. And those of us who knew Jim loved him, and he will never be forgotten.
Are you looking for the newest and hottest in the world of pro wrestling? Then check out the amazing action on Powerslam.tv, the biggest indie pro wrestling channel in the world. Get over 6,000 hours of the best events from over 150 of your favorite promotions from 20 different countries around the globe. Brands like Progress Wrestling, Evolve Wrestling, Combat Zone, Defy, PCW Ultra, PWX, Over the Top, Shine, and hundreds of others with fresh content added every day for only $5.99 per month. Get your free trial today at Powerslam.tv.
Just use promo code DYNASTY. If you are looking for the best books, DVDs, and posters on classic wrestling nostalgia, then you want to visit crowbarpress.com. There are literally dozens of titles there, including biographies of the likes of Bruiser Brody, Ole Anderson, Ivan Koloff, and of course, Dick the Bruiser, as we've spoke about here on the Dave Dynasty Show. You want to visit crowbarpress.com for all of your classic wrestling nostalgia needs. Again, that is crowbarpress.com. And we are back. Thank you to John Lawson for coming on and sharing those memories of that final WWA Fairgrounds show from 1980, and for sharing his memories and wisdom on Jim Busche. And our thoughts and condolences and prayers go out to Jim Busche's family and those friends and those that knew him. I know we have a lot of people who knew him well from the area, and our thoughts go out to them. Jim Busche was, I met him a couple different times at a few shows here and there. Never really got to know him that well, but always knew of him, obviously. And again, our thoughts go out, and I think it's important that we always make sure we remember him, as well as everybody in our community that we lose. It's important to keep that memory alive and to keep them in our thoughts and in this sport and business that they love so much. We will be back next week with another episode. We're working on lots of great things for the future. We're going to work on a memorial episode to Rene Goulet, who we just recently lost, who wrestled a lot in Indianapolis as Jacques Goulet of the Legionnaires. We're going to do a show on him with John Lawson. I hope to have some of our old friends on to talk, Richard Vicek, Chris Parsons, George Shire, a lot of these guys back on, Mick Harsh, a lot of these guys back to talk about Midwest wrestling. We're going to hope to have them a lot of appearances by them this year to talk about various things. I'm going to do an episode where I would like to talk with some people and have us debate and state our case for Cowboy Bob Ellis to be in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. As you know, every year at the end of the year, Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer newsletter does a Hall of Fame balloting, and to me, their Hall of Fame is very important. And Cowboy Bob Ellis is not in there yet, and it boggles my mind. And I think it's because a lot of people are not aware of the career and accomplishments of Bob Ellis. So I like to have some people on, and we're going to state the case. We're going to state the case, provide the evidence for Bob Ellis to be in that Hall of Fame. And speaking of Hall of Fames, I like there's some new Hall of Fames that are really expanding. I won't say new, but they're having a lot of new developments. And I'd like to have some people on. We're going to talk about those and what they're doing, and some brick and mortar Hall of Fames that are out there. And I'd like to have some people on to talk about the Cauliflower Alley Club, and think what I want to talk about is these organizations that are really doing it right to preserve and promote and enlighten people on the history of professional wrestling. I like to have authors on and talk about books that they put out. I know there's a biography being written on the Sheik that we will be talking about with the author of that when the time comes closer to the release of that. We're going to have him on to discuss that. And it's lots of things like that. I think it's very important to make sure we bring eyes on this stuff and give the proper enlightenment and exposure to the history of professional wrestling. And like I said, our focus here is on the Midwest. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing and supporting us. Like I said, we are glad to be back. You can support us if you would like financially, because it helps keep this show rolling and helps us with our hosting costs and equipment costs and everything like that. So you go to paypal.me/the Dave Dynasty to make a one-time contribution. Anything helps. We would appreciate any way you could help support us. And you can also go to patreon.com/The Dave Dynasty. If you'd like to make ongoing monthly contributions to the show, again, we would appreciate that. It helps keep us rolling. It helps us keep what we do and keep the show free every month for you. We will be back next week. We are officially back. We are riding high. The Midwest Express is chugging down the tracks. We thank you for being here and thank you for supporting us. And until next week, and anything you do and wherever you go, be good, be safe, and keep on growing.